Dominic Hayes just wanted to find a quiet seat for his daughter after a long overnight drive, but at the entrance to the airport lounge, he was turned away. Economy ticket, no membership card, wrong kind of shoes. Catherine Monroe glanced at his worn heels, his daughter's small backpack, and said it loud enough for the room to hear. This place was not for people like him. Dominic took Violet's hand and started to leave. Then Captain Samuel Reed stepped out of the corridor, stopped cold, and asked a question that silenced the entire lounge. What is his name? The terminal at Denver International came alive long before most of the city did. By 5:45 in the morning, the overhead lights were already blazing white against the tile. The departure boards were cycling through their updates, and the air carried that particular stillness that only exists in airports, a held breath before the noise fully arrives. Families dragged rolling suitcases across the polished floor. Business travelers in pressed suits moved through the checkpoint lines with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times. Somewhere overhead, a gate announcement echoed through the concourse, clipped and impersonal, directing passengers for the 6:15 flight to Cincinnati. Dominic Hayes was not moving quickly. He carried a small duffel on one shoulder and had a child's purple backpack slung over the other. His own bag was a wheeled carry-on, dark navy with a broken zipper pull he had replaced with a carabiner from a hardware store. His coat was a brown canvas field jacket, soft with age, its elbows faintly shiny from years of wear. Beneath it he had on a pale blue button-down shirt that had been ironed sometime last week, and dark jeans, and a pair of black leather shoes with the heels worn down to an angle that said they had been resoled once and would probably need it again soon. He was 34 years old, and looked like a man who had been awake for most of the night, which he had. Beside him walked Violet. She was 7, small for her age, wearing a lavender hoodie and holding a stuffed bear named Biscuit that she had owned since she was 2. She had fallen asleep during the 3-hour drive from home and woken up an hour before they reached the terminal, and her eyes still carried the particular redness that comes from not enough sleep and a little crying no one had mentioned. She had a mild history of asthma, nothing severe, but enough that her father kept a small rescue inhaler in the front pocket of her backpack at all times, along with travel-sized tissues and a reusable water bottle with a yellow cap. Dominic checked on her constantly without appearing to. Every few dozen feet, he would glance down, not dramatically. Just the small surveillance of a father who was always running a quiet background calculation about whether his child was okay. He offered her water twice. He pulled the neck of her hoodie up against the air conditioning. When she coughed twice in a row near the security checkpoint, he stopped walking entirely, crouched down to her level, and rested one hand across her upper back while he watched her breathe. Their flight to Colorado Springs had been scheduled for 7 to 10. Sometime around midnight, while Dominic was loading the car, a notification came through that the departure was pushed back to 9:15 due to a maintenance hold on the assigned aircraft. 2 hours and 5 minutes of extra waiting. He had packed snacks, her medication, a spare change of clothes for her. What he had not packed was a plan for where they would sit. He had spoken to a gate agent at check-in, who had, in the vague way of someone managing too many situations at once, mentioned that the lounge sometimes offered day access arrangements, and that families on delayed flights occasionally qualified for a courtesy visit. She had not promised anything. She had said you could ask in the tone of someone who was already thinking about something else. Dominic had noted it. He was not the kind of man who asked for things without good reason, but Violet's cough had picked up since they entered the building, and the main waiting area was already filling with noise, and he wanted her somewhere quiet for an hour. They stopped outside the entrance to the President's Club Lounge on Concourse B. Through the glass, Dominic could see low leather chairs, warm lighting, a buffet line with steam trays, and a scattering of passengers speaking quietly into phones or working on laptops. It looked like a different country from the terminal outside. Violet looked in the way a child looks at something nice with uncomplicated longing and no resentment, because she was 7 and had not yet learned to mask wanting things. "Dad," she said, "are we allowed in there?" Dominic looked at her. He adjusted the strap of her backpack on his shoulder and managed a tired smile. "Only one way to find out," he said. "And if not, we'll find somewhere else. It's fine either way." He straightened up, rolled his shoulders back once, and walked to the reception desk. The woman at the desk was Grace Whitman, 28, with dark hair pinned back and a name tag that caught the light. She smiled the automatic smile of someone well-trained and looked at the boarding pass Dominic slid across the counter. Her eyes moved over it efficiently. Economy fare. No membership indicator. No lounge access code. She started to explain the access requirements in the careful tone of someone trying to be kind while delivering bad news. Dominic listened, without interrupting. He said that he understood the standard policy, and asked whether there was a day access rate he could pay, or some arrangement for a delayed flight with a child. He kept his voice level. He said, "Please," twice. Grace was still composing her answer when Catherine Monroe appeared. Catherine was the lounge manager. She was 42, with ash blonde hair in a smooth chignon, and a cream blazer with no wrinkles in it anywhere. Her name tag was polished silver. She carried herself with the ease of someone who understood hierarchy and had long since positioned herself comfortably within it. She took in the situation in approximately 3 seconds. The boarding pass on the counter, the carry-on, the child with the stuffed bear, the man's worn coat. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. "Is there a question about access?" she asked Grace, though she was looking at Dominic. Dominic explained again the delayed flight, his daughter's fatigue, the inquiry about a paid day pass. He was polite. He was concise. He did not appeal to sympathy or exaggerate Violet's condition. He simply stated the facts in the order they had occurred. Catherine folded her hands on the counter edge. "I'm afraid the lounge is restricted to members, eligible frequent flyer cardholders, and business class passengers. We're not able to offer walk-in access today." She paused. "The lounge is nearly at capacity." Dominic looked around at the room beyond the glass. It was perhaps 2/3 full. He did not say this. He said, "I understand. Is there a paid option at all, just for the duration of the delay?" "We don't offer that arrangement for non-qualifying passengers," Catherine said. The phrase "non-qualifying passengers" was delivered cleanly, without visible malice. But it had a shape to it. It landed on the ear the way a formal letter lands, official and final and slightly cold. "I see." Dominic nodded. "My daughter has mild asthma. She had a long drive last night, and she's a little worn out. I was hoping to find somewhere quieter than the main terminal." Catherine allowed a brief silence. Then, "The main concourse seating areas are available to all passengers." She stressed the word "all" in a way that was not generous. A man nearby in a charcoal suit glanced over the rim of his coffee cup. An older couple near the window turned to look. The small theater of it had already begun. The way these moments always do, people nearby catching enough to form an opinion. Dominic put his hand on Violet's shoulder. "All right," he said quietly, to his daughter. "We'll find something else." He looked at Catherine and said, "Thank you for your time." He was already turning when Catherine spoke again. She addressed Grace in the same carrying voice, just loud enough to reach the nearby seats. "Please make a note that we've had several walk-up inquiries today. We should have a response ready at the podium to redirect people before they get to the counter." The word "people" was not cruel on its own, but paired with the look she gave Grace, a small, downward flicker of the eyes toward where Dominic stood, it had an effect. It sorted him. It filed him somewhere. Violet had heard every word. She had not said anything. She had just shifted closer to her father's side. "Dad," she whispered as they walked away. "Did we do something wrong?" Dominic answered immediately, without hesitation, the way he always answered her important questions. "No, sweetheart. We asked politely. That's never wrong." The main concourse seating was exactly what he had expected. Every cluster of chairs occupied by at least one person. Rolling suitcases parked across armrests to claim territory. A group of teenagers spread across an entire row near the windows. A family with 3 small children who had constructed what appeared to be a fort from coats and tote bags. The noise level was a constant warm hum that would have been fine for adults on a normal morning and was completely wrong for a 7-year-old fighting the beginning of a breathing flare. Violet coughed again 3 times in a row, dry and shallow. Dominic guided her to a section of floor near a support column that was slightly out of the main foot traffic, set down the duffel, and crouched in front of her. He retrieved the inhaler, shook it twice, and held it to her lips the way they had practiced together so many times that neither of them needed to speak. 2 puffs. "Wait. Breathe slowly. Watch her chest rise and fall." An older woman on a nearby bench shifted and patted the seat beside her. "She can sit here, honey," the woman said. Dominic thanked her. Violet sat, and the woman moved her own bag to make room, and that small act of ordinary kindness struck Dominic harder than he expected. He sat on the floor beside his daughter, back against the column, and watched the departures board. After a few quiet minutes, Violet said, "Is it because we don't have enough money for the fancy place?" He thought about the question carefully. He had a policy, with her, of not lying and also not grieving out loud in ways she would absorb. He looked at the scuffed toe of his shoe and then at her face. "Sometimes," he said, "people read the ticket before they read the person." Violet considered this. She turned the stuffed bear over in her hands. "That doesn't seem right," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." Inside the lounge, Catherine had moved to her desk near the inner wall and was organizing paperwork. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass near the entrance, she had a clear sightline to the concourse. She saw Dominic settle on the floor with his daughter, the child with the inhaler, the old woman on the bench. She watched for a moment, then looked back at her papers. Grace, standing closer to the glass, saw the same thing and felt something specific and uncomfortable in her chest. She turned to Catherine and said, carefully, "We could offer them the side bench, near the charging stations. It's technically in the transition area, not the main lounge." "Grace," Catherine said, without looking up, "if we make exceptions, we create expectations. The program only works if the access criteria are consistent." Grace went quiet. She had heard this reasoning before. It was not wrong, exactly. But it had a way of making logic into a wall. A passenger sitting near the lounge entrance, a man in a light gray blazer who was waiting for a traveling companion, had apparently also been watching through the glass. He said to Catherine as she walked past, "I hope that situation isn't going to become a thing. I didn't pay for a club membership to watch the lounge turn into a babysitting area." He said it pleasantly, in the tone of someone making an observation rather than a complaint. Catherine smiled professionally and moved on. But Violet had heard, because the lounge entrance was not far away, and voices carry in terminal buildings. The little girl's grip on Biscuit tightened until her knuckles went slightly pale. Dominic decided to try one more time, not to get into the lounge but to ask a simpler question. He went back to the reception desk and waited until Grace was free, then asked quietly whether the airport had a children's wellness room or a medical quiet space for passengers with respiratory conditions. It was a reasonable question. He asked it without any edge. He did not reach the answer. Catherine came to the desk before Grace could respond. "Sir," she said, "I've already explained the situation. This entrance area needs to remain clear for authorized guests. If you continue to approach the desk, I'm going to have to contact airport security." Dominic blinked. "I was asking about the medical facilities. For my daughter, this area is for eligible passengers," Catherine said. The sentence was the same one she had used before. It did not get warmer with repetition. Violet had followed him to the counter. She heard the exchange. She did not say anything. She started to cry quietly, with her face turned toward her father's jacket, the way children cry when they are trying to be invisible. Dominic bent down and picked her up. She was 7, nearly too old for this, but she wrapped her arms around his neck without thinking about it. He turned and walked, carrying her, and said nothing more to anyone at the counter. He found a corner near the far end of the concourse where a row of windows looked out over the tarmac. The morning light was coming in low and sideways, orange-white against the concrete, and the view was of fuel trucks and baggage carts and the broad gray backs of aircraft. Dominic folded his jacket into a rough cushion on the floor and helped Violet settle against the window base. He found her crackers and her water bottle and a set of foam-tipped headphones from the duffel. She put them in without asking what she was listening to. She just needed the quiet. After a few minutes, she asked, "Dad, why don't you fly like the guys in the uniforms?" He looked out at the tarmac. A regional jet was being pushed back from the gate across the way, its navigation lights blinking in the thin morning. "I used to work near planes," he said. "A long time ago." "What did you do?" He chose the simplified version, the one that was true without being the whole truth. "I worked with radio equipment. I helped pilots talk to the ground." "That sounds important." "It can be," he said. What he did not tell her was the fuller story. For nearly 6 years, Dominic had worked at a small regional airfield in central Ohio, first as a radio maintenance technician, then as part of an emergency communications support unit that operated alongside, but outside the main air traffic control system. The unit was not glamorous. It existed in the margins of the aviation infrastructure, staffed by people who understood radio propagation, emergency protocols, and the specific patience required to keep their heads when the official channels had failed. He had taken emergency certification courses, studied procedure manuals during lunch breaks, and developed a natural facility for the thing that mattered most in crisis communication: the ability to make his voice slower and calmer as the situation became faster and worse. Dominic knew instinctively that pilots under stress respond to the emotional temperature of what they hear. He had been part of 3 declared emergencies during his 6 years on the job. The third, the one Samuel Reed would later describe, was the most serious by far. But even the first 2 had required him to maintain contact through weather interference, equipment degradation, and the silence that falls when a pilot stops responding, and you have no way of knowing why. He had left the job not because he was asked to, and not because he had done anything wrong. He had left because his wife, Claire, had been diagnosed with a progressive illness that took her in 2.5 years, and during that time he had rearranged his schedule so many times the administration had quietly stopped accommodating him and arrived to pick up Violet from the hospital childcare room at midnight, often enough that he had eventually decided something had to go. He chose the career. He did not believe he had made the wrong choice. "The most important job I have," he said to Violet now, "is the one I'm doing right now." She looked up at him. Her eyes were still red, but she had stopped crying. "Being my dad? Being your dad," he confirmed. His phone buzzed. A message from his mother-in-law's neighbor, passing along an update from the hospital. Ellen's condition had stabilized overnight, the message said, but the doctors were cautious, and the family wanted to know when they'd arrive. Dominic looked at the departure board. The 9:15 delay still held. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them, and put the phone back in his pocket. Through the window, a group of uniformed crew members moved past on the concourse walkway. 4 of them, headed toward the B gates, 2 women and 2 men. One of the men was tall, silver-haired, wearing 4 stripes on his epaulette. He walked with the measured confidence of someone who had been inside an aircraft cockpit more times than he could count. He did not look toward the window. He disappeared around the curve of the concourse. Dominic watched them go, then looked back at his daughter, who had fallen into a light doze with her head against his shoulder. Catherine had not let the matter go. From her position inside the lounge, she had intermittently observed Dominic and Violet through the concourse glass. And what she saw she interpreted through the framework she had spent years building. A man denied access who had not fully left. She concluded he was trying to pressure his way in by making himself visible. She was wrong. Dominic had stayed near that section because it had the only available power outlet nearby, a low panel beside a cleaning supply closet, and his phone battery was at 11%. Ellen's condition was unstable. He needed to be reachable. Catherine came out with Grace. She approached Dominic, who was sitting on the floor with Violet asleep against him, and said that this area needed to stay clear for lounge access. She said it without cruelty, but without softness either. She said the exact same thing she had said before. Dominic looked up at her. He said, very quietly, that his daughter was asleep, and he was charging his phone because his daughter's grandmother was in the hospital in Colorado, and he needed to be reachable. He said he would move when a seat opened up in the main concourse, or when his phone had enough charge to last the flight, whichever came first. He said it all in the same low, steady voice he had been using all morning. Catherine said that was not her problem, and that she would have to contact airport security if he did not move away from the lounge entrance area. "You've already said my daughter was using this situation to get what she wanted," Dominic said. His voice was still quiet, but it had changed shape slightly, not louder, just denser. "She's 7. She's asleep. Please don't say things like that in front of her." Catherine took his response as a challenge to her authority. She pulled out her radio and called for Hunter Collins. Hunter was 39, experienced, and professional. He arrived within 4 minutes, assessed the scene, and asked both parties to explain. Catherine described a passenger who had been denied access and had continued to remain in the restricted approach zone, returning to the counter multiple times. Dominic said he was a delayed flight passenger with a sick child who had been using a nearby power outlet and had asked a question about medical facilities, nothing more. Hunter listened to both accounts. His body language was neutral. He was not aggressive, but his presence changed the geometry of the situation entirely. And both Dominic and Violet understood this at an animal level. When Violet woke, which she did, because voices travel even through sleep, she saw a man in a security uniform standing over her father. "Dad," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Are we in trouble?" Dominic put his phone down and turned to her with complete attention, the way he always did when she needed to be his only focus. He said, "No, you're safe. I'm right here." He said it without looking at Catherine or Hunter. He said it the way you say things that need to be simply and permanently true. Grace stood a few feet back. She watched the little girl's face. She had not wanted any of this to happen, and she was only now beginning to understand that wanting it not to happen had not been the same as doing something to stop it. Several passengers nearby had slowed down, and 2 were filming on their phones. Dominic noticed. He shifted his body so that he was between the cameras and Violet, not aggressively, not drawing attention to the movement, just placing himself as a screen. He did not want his daughter's distress on record somewhere. Hunter had just opened his mouth to suggest Dominic relocate when footsteps came from the crew corridor that connected to the B gates, measured, uniform-booted footsteps, the kind that move with specific authority through airport spaces. 4 crew members rounded the corner. At the front walked Captain Samuel Reed, 49 years old, in full-dress uniform, cap under his arm. He was heading for the lounge to use the flight crew facilities before boarding began. He saw the security officer. He saw the man on the floor with a child. He stopped. Catherine, still managing the scene from the lounge entrance, said to no one in particular, "He keeps insisting, but he's just an economy passenger." Samuel Reed turned toward her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What is his name?" It was not the question anyone had expected. Catherine blinked. She started to say something about access credentials and the scope of the issue, but Samuel did not follow her into that sentence. He looked at her with the focused patience of a man who had learned, over many years, to ask the question that actually mattered and wait for the answer. "His name," Samuel said again. "What is it?" Grace still had the boarding pass. She looked down at it. "Dominic Hayes," she said. The name moved through Samuel Reed like a current. He stood completely still for a moment that was impossible to measure. 2 seconds. 5. The kind of stillness that makes the people around it aware that something real is happening. The terminal sounds continued at full volume around them. Wheels on tile, a boarding announcement, a child laughing somewhere down the concourse, but the small group near the lounge entrance seemed to slow down inside all of it. Samuel turned and looked at Dominic directly. Dominic looked back. He did not yet know who this man was to him. He saw the 4 stripes. He saw the silver hair and the calm-lined face of someone who had spent decades watching horizon lines. "Dominic Hayes," Samuel said. There was something in the way he said the name, not dramatic, just weighted. The way you say the name of something you have been carrying for a long time. "Did you work at Dayton Regional Support Station? Radio and communications?" Dominic went very still. "That was a long time ago," he said. "November," Samuel said. "Heavy snowstorm. Flight 417. The air in Dominic's chest changed. He recognized the sequence of words, the way you recognize the opening bars of something you have not heard in years, but know instantly, completely, in your body. He said, "I remember the storm." Samuel removed his captain's hat. He held it in both hands in front of his chest, not a formal gesture, not theatrical, but the kind of thing a person does when they want to hold something still, because the moment calls for it. He spoke loudly enough for those nearby to hear, but he was not performing. He was simply not willing, after this particular coincidence had dropped itself into his morning, to whisper what he said next. "I was the first officer on that flight," Samuel said. "I was at the controls when the captain went down. The main comm system was failing in and out. We were in instrument conditions with severe turbulence and a contaminated approach path." He paused. "You were the voice on the backup frequency. You were the only voice." Hunter Collins, who had been holding his radio in one hand and had not moved, lowered his arm. Catherine's posture changed, not dramatically, but the way a structure changes when one of its load-bearing assumptions is removed. Jason Parker, the first officer standing behind Samuel, stared at his captain. In 11 years of flying with him, Samuel Reed had never once told this story. Violet was looking at her father. Her mouth was slightly open. She did not know what was being said. Not all of it, not yet. But she knew the room had changed around him. Samuel looked at Catherine, and then back at Dominic, and said, "The man you just refused, he is the reason I'm standing here wearing this uniform today." Samuel told it slowly, the way people tell important stories without flourish, with the specific weight of things that actually happened. The date was a Tuesday in late November. The flight was a regional service, 72 passengers, routing through deteriorating weather that had been borderline on the pre-flight assessment and turned decisively bad by the time they were on approach. The captain was a veteran named Donald Marsh, 23 years in commercial aviation, the kind of pilot Samuel had specifically chosen to fly under. He trusted the man entirely. The turbulence hit in a sequence the meteorological analysis would later describe as unusually severe for the altitude and approach vector. The second significant jolt threw the captain's head against the side window hard enough to cause a brief loss of consciousness. He came back within 40 seconds, but his coordination was compromised. His hands were responding incorrectly to what his eyes told him, a vestibular disruption that Samuel had never witnessed in real time until that moment. "He was trying," Samuel said. "Donald was fighting to help me, but he couldn't trust his own hands. And I was 29 years old and I had never been in command of anything in conditions like those." The main communication system had degraded across multiple frequencies due to the storm's electrical interference. The backup VHF radio was functioning intermittently. Samuel made 5 calls across 3 frequencies in 90 seconds and got fragments back enough to know someone was hearing him, not enough to know if the information was getting through. Then a voice came back on the backup frequency. Steady. Very clear. Not panicked. Not reading from a script. Not over-technical. It started with, "Flight 417. This is ground support on backup. I have you. Say your altitude and heading." That was Dominic. He had been on the tail end of a maintenance shift at the secondary radio station 12 miles from the main airport. He had heard the fragmented Mayday call on a frequency he happened to have opened because he was running a routine signal test. He was not air traffic control. He had no formal authority to issue guidance. He had the knowledge, the equipment, and the specific emotional architecture required to be exactly what Samuel needed. "He didn't try to fly the plane," Samuel said. "He knew he couldn't do that. What he did was keep me from disappearing inside my own head." Dominic had read the wind data. He had confirmed the runway orientation and the updated altimeter setting from the surface station. He had talked Samuel through the checklist items in the order that mattered, not in the order the manual printed them, but in the order a frightened 29-year-old first officer with shaking hands needed to hear them. He had said, at the moment when the approach plate numbers blurred and the warnings were stacking up, "You don't need the whole sky. You only need the next 100 feet." Samuel repeated the line in the airport corridor, and it sounded exactly as it had sounded in the cockpit all those years ago, not poetic, not inspirational, just true in the specific way that useful things are true when you need them. Dominic listened to all of this with his eyes mostly on the floor. He did not interrupt. He did not add details. When Samuel finished, he said, "You landed that airplane. I was just noise management." Samuel shook his head. "I held the controls," he said. "You held me together." Catherine had not moved from her position near the lounge entrance. She was listening. The performance had left her face entirely. She was just a person, standing, realizing the distance between what she had seen and what had been true. Samuel looked down at Violet, who was standing very close to her father now, one arm looped around his elbow. He said, "Your dad helped bring a plane full of people home once." Violet looked up at Dominic. Her face was complicated amazement, and something else, the particular feeling a child has when they understand for the first time that their parent had a whole life before them. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because getting you home mattered more." The night it happened, Dominic had been working a closeout shift at the Dayton Regional Support Station, a cinder-block building at the edge of an airfield that mostly served light aircraft and charter operations. The room was small and warm, lit by instrument panels, with a window looking out over the approach lights. Snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, and by 9 in the evening it was blowing across the runway indicators in curtains, and the field beyond was flat and gray and indistinct. He had been 26 years old. He had been with Claire for 3 years, and she was in the early stages of an illness they had not yet fully named. They were keeping that fear in a small box, the way young people do. He worked the late shifts because the differential paid better. He had the backup frequency open out of habit, running a transmit-receive test on the secondary transceiver. The Mayday signal came across it broken and compressed 3 syllables, then static, then a fragment about partial communications, then a pilot's voice that had the specific quality of a person who knows they are in serious trouble and is trying very hard not to sound like it. Dominic had already hit the recording switch and was on the telephone to the main control tower before he consciously decided to do either. The tower was aware and managing, but the connection to the aircraft was intermittent, and they were glad to have another relay point. He was authorized to maintain contact on the backup frequency and pass anything he could receive. What followed was 31 minutes. He did not experience them as 31 minutes. He experienced them as a sequence of problems, each requiring the full width of his attention before the next appeared. The pilot in the cockpit was technically competent but emotionally overwhelmed, and the difference between those two states is the margin in which disasters happen. Dominic's job was to keep that margin from closing. He read the wind shear data from the surface station instruments in front of him and called it across in plain language. He confirmed the instrument landing system frequency and reminded the pilot of the course deviation corrections required for the runway in use. When the cockpit voice recorder would later capture Samuel's breathing rate spiking above the threshold associated with performance degradation, it would also capture Dominic's voice arriving at exactly that moment with an instruction and a number, something concrete, something small, something that required only one action and could only have one result. Partway through, Dominic's personal cell phone lit up on the desk. It was the number for the medical center where Claire had had her most recent appointment. He looked at it. He put his left hand over the phone and returned his full attention to the radio. The call went to voicemail. He called back 17 minutes later, after the aircraft had touched down, tires shrieking on the icy pavement, reverse thrust, rattling his cinderblock walls from a mile away, and learned that the doctors had urgent news and he needed to come in the following morning. He wrote his incident report. He logged the time codes. He shut down the equipment in order. Then he sat alone for a few minutes with his hands flat on the desk, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the adrenaline pass through him the way weather passes. He did not tell Claire what had happened that night until several weeks later, and even then he told it briefly, as a work story. He had not wanted it to become a big story. It had felt, from the inside, like doing his job. In the airport corridor, Samuel said, "Every time I fly over Ohio in winter, I think about that frequency." Grace had turned away. She was looking out the window, and the reflection in the glass showed that her eyes were wet. Hunter Collins stood with his radio held at his side and said nothing. He looked at Dominic with an expression that required no translation. Madison Clark arrived 6 minutes later. She was the airline's senior passenger services manager for the concourse, flagged by a gate agent who had seen the crowd. She had pulled the company's emergency communications archive on her phone during the walkover, and by the time she reached the group she had already found the internal record for Flight 417, 3 paragraphs in the safety log, a commendation appended to the file. Dominic Hayes was in it. She apologized to Dominic directly, looking at him and not at the air beside him. She apologized to Violet. She offered them access to the lounge, a private room if they preferred, food, anything the airline could provide. Samuel added that if the flight had any premium seating available, he intended to see to the upgrade personally. Dominic did not move toward the lounge door immediately. He looked at Catherine, then he looked down at Violet. Then he said to Madison, in a voice that was entirely measured and not angry, though it had every right to be, "What upset me wasn't being told no according to the rules. I understand rules. What upset me was the way my daughter was made to feel like she didn't belong anywhere in this building." Madison said, "You're right, and I'm sorry." Catherine tried. She said, "I apologize if you felt that." Dominic stopped her gently. He did not raise his voice. He said, "Not if." She heard every word. She cried. He left a pause. "Please, don't apologize for how I felt. Apologize for what happened." There was a silence. Catherine held it. Then she said, "I'm sorry for what I said, and for how I treated your daughter." She looked at Violet. I'm sorry I made you feel unwelcome. Violet said nothing for a moment. She looked at her father, checking something, reading him. Dominic did not prompt her. He did not tell her she had to accept the apology, or that she had to say anything at all. He just kept his hand on her shoulder and let her decide. Grace stepped forward. She said, I should have said something earlier. I knew it wasn't right, and I stayed quiet. I'm sorry for that too. Dominic nodded at Grace. His face was not hard. He did not have any particular desire to make this worse for anyone, but he said to Madison, before he moved toward the door, the next time a father comes to this desk with a sick child and a delayed flight, I hope no one needs a captain to vouch for them before someone treats them like a person. Samuel said quietly, I'll be writing that into my crew report. Madison said she would flag the interaction for the customer care training cycle and that a policy review of family accommodation during extended delays would go on the agenda for the quarter. It was a specific, achievable thing, the kind of small institutional correction that most people never hear about, but that changes the shape of the next situation. Violet said nothing. She looked at the chairs and the warm lighting and the steam from the breakfast buffet, then up at her father, and her face had something new in it, not triumph. Just calm. The lounge was quiet at this hour. A few passengers sat with newspapers or laptops, and low background music threaded through the room at a volume designed to disappear. Grace found them a corner near the east-facing windows where the morning light came in warm, and the mountains were beginning to emerge from their early haze. She brought a blanket and a small tray tea, orange juice, buttered toast, warm soup. She did not say much. She set it down and put her hand briefly on the back of Violet's chair before she left. Violet ate, slowly, methodically, the way a child eats when they are finally somewhere safe enough to actually be hungry. She ate almost everything on the tray, and when she was done she tucked the blanket around her legs and leaned back into the chair, and her breathing was, at last, even. A man who had been sitting near the entrance when the whole incident unfolded came over and extended his hand to Dominic. He said he had overheard and that he was grateful that he had once been on a regional flight that diverted in weather and had wondered, afterward, how much the people behind the instruments had mattered. Dominic shook his hand and thanked him and did not elaborate. Another passenger called him a hero. Dominic shifted in his chair and said, I was doing a job I was trained to do. Any of the other people on that shift would have done the same thing. Samuel, who had settled into the chair across from Dominic while his first officer went to complete pre-flight paperwork, shook his head. That's not true, he said. I've spent 20 years flying with people who are technically competent. What you had was different. You knew how to hold a person steady when their hands were failing them. That's not in any manual. Dominic looked at his daughter, who had her eyes half closed and was still holding Biscuit against her side. He said, I learned most of what I know about staying calm from being a father. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what had brought Dominic out of aviation entirely. I tried going back after Claire died, Dominic said. I got as far as a week of night shifts. Every Mayday call, even training exercises, brought back the hospital monitors. Violet was 3. She needed someone fully present. Samuel said, Aviation lost a good man. Dominic looked over at his daughter. The morning light was touching her hair and she had finally, completely, fallen asleep. Maybe, he said. But she didn't lose her father. Samuel held that for a moment. Then he said, No, she didn't. Violet asked, when she stirred 15 minutes later. Dad, why weren't you angry at those people? Dominic thought about the question in the way he tried to think about all of her real questions, not looking for the easy answer, looking for the true one. He said, I was angry. I just didn't let it drive. What does that mean? It means anger can ride in the car, he said. It just can't be the one with its hands on the wheel. She thought about this for a while. Then she said, Is that like how you told the pilot what to look at instead of the storm? He looked at her. Sometimes she surprised him so completely that he had no immediate answer. He said, Yes, exactly like that. When the boarding announcement came for their flight, Madison was waiting at the gate with 2 boarding passes printed with a new seat assignment, row 5, window and middle, with more legroom than the seats they had originally booked. She did not make a production of it. She just handed them over and said she hoped the rest of their trip was smooth. Samuel Reed was already at the aircraft door when they boarded. He had positioned himself there on purpose, which his first officer Jason had observed and said nothing about. because some things do not require comment. When Violet reached the door, Samuel crouched down to her level. He said, "I'm very glad you're on this flight." Violet studied him. She said, "Are you scared when you fly?" Samuel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Sometimes," he said. "But your father taught me something once, a long time ago, that I still think about." "What did he teach you?" "He taught me that you don't need the whole sky," Samuel said. "You only need the next 100 feet. Violet turned around and looked at Dominic with the specific look that children give their parents when a stranger has confirmed something important, validation arriving from an unexpected direction, more vivid for that reason. Dominic's eyes were bright. He was smiling but barely, the way people smile when they are not sure they can trust their own face. He thanked Samuel. They shook hands, and Samuel held the grip a moment longer than a handshake usually requires, the way men hold on when what they mean is something that does not have a word. Before Dominic stepped through the door, Samuel turned to his crew and said, in the tone he used for things he wanted remembered, "There is a passenger on this flight today who once talked a plane full of people safely onto the ground in conditions that would have broken most of us. He doesn't need recognition, but I want this crew to serve this flight knowing what we owe to people like him." The flight attendants listened. No one applauded. It was not that kind of moment. It was quieter than that, and more real. Catherine Monroe was in the lounge when the boarding gate closed. She had stayed at her post, which was the right thing to do. From the lounge windows, she could see the aircraft at the gate, the jetway retracted, the pushback truck maneuvering into position. She watched it for a moment, then turned back to the room. The sign on the door read "Members Only" in polished silver letters. She reached up, straightened it. It had been sitting at a faint angle for months, and then stood with her hand resting on the frame for a moment before she walked back to her desk. On the aircraft, row 5 was quiet. Violet had the window and was watching the ground crew in their orange vests, moving with purpose in the morning light. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. "It's pretty from up here," she said. "Wait until we're in the air," Dominic told her. The aircraft pushed back. The engines spooled up in their measured sequence. Dominic leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to feel the particular vibration of the fuselage beginning to move. Something he had not felt as a passenger in several years. In the cockpit, Samuel ran the before-taxi checklist with Jason. His hands moved through the familiar items: flight controls, instruments, transponder. He had done this thousands of times. He would do it thousands more if luck held. Each time, somewhere inside the routine, he carried a quiet knowledge of how thin the margin was, how much the invisible people had mattered, how many departures and arrivals depended on voices no one had ever seen or named. He called the tower. "Denver ground, flight 249 heavy, ready to taxi, runway 2-5 left." The tower responded. The aircraft began to move. In row 5, Violet fell asleep somewhere during the taxi to the runway, her head resting against her father's arm, one hand still loosely holding Biscuit, the other resting open in Dominic's palm. He sat with her like that quietly, without moving, the way you sit with sleeping children, when you know there is nowhere else you need to be, and no version of yourself you need to perform for anyone. As the aircraft turned onto the runway, and the engines pressed them both back into their seats and the ground fell away beneath them, and the clouds received them into their ordinary, silent immensity. In the departure lounge behind them, a gate agent called the next flight. A man in a wrinkled shirt jogged toward the door. The morning continued its work. Most of the people who had witnessed the hour in Concourse B had already moved on to their own destinations, their own delays, their own small emergencies. But somewhere over the mountains, a little girl slept against her father's shoulder, and the man who flew them west knew, without needing to look at the manifest, which seat held the name that had once reached him through static and storm and pulled him back from the edge of something he would not have survived alone. Some people walk through airports carrying nothing visible. No uniform, no title, no signal of what they have done or been or given. They carry economy tickets and worn shoes and children who need them. They ask politely and accept refusals and find corners to sit in, and they do not announce themselves, because the things they have done are not the kind that require announcement. They simply happened, at the right moment, to know exactly what to say.